to the remains of America's first space station. Skylab fell from the skies near Perth, Australia at 9:31 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time, July 11, 1979.
Most have already forgotten the Skylab mania, the press hype, and the honest apprehension that accompanied Skylab's fall. But News Center 4 has discovered new facts about Skylab's re-entry, facts that show that NASA knew where Skylab would fall. Our search took us thousands of miles around the world, to a top-secret U.S. base, and finally to a world of espionage and deception that has its origin not with Skylab, but within the heart of the Cold War itself. The historical roots of what we found took place nearly 20 years ago, the day that John Kennedy committed the United States to his new frontier. February 20th, 1962, John Glenn becomes the first American to orbit the Earth.
Roger, that's Perth and Rockingham you're seeing there. Roger, the lights show up very well, and thank everybody for turning them on, will you?
July 20th, 1969, Kennedy's dream became a reality.
The plaque we left behind on the moon said we came in peace for all mankind. But did we? Kennedy wanted us into space to beat the Russians, for military purposes as well as peaceful.
For space science, like nuclear science and all technology, has no conscience of its own. Whether it will become a force for good or ill depends on man.
1971. Skylab comes off the drawing boards. She is part Apollo and part fantasy. The NASA scientists had done everything humanly possible to ensure Skylab's mission. There were safeguards on the safeguards. 3 widgets were 2 would do. The can-do NASA team had foreseen every eventuality but one: how to get her back. Once in orbit, Skylab's remote sensing cameras for the first time permitted man to chart the entire planet. But Skylab's solar research told NASA scientists as early as 1974 that the sun's increased activity would push Skylab down into the Earth's atmosphere sooner than NASA's 1983 projected date. January 1978. Concern over falling satellites is sharpened when Soviet spy satellite Cosmos 954 crashes into the Northwest Territories of Canada. February 1978. Skylab is alone in space now, forgotten by the very men who built her, drifting, slowly tumbling end over end. NASA's re-entry specialist Herman Thomason is sent to Bermuda. He is given less than a 5% chance in locating Skylab. But back in 1974, controllers had the foresight to leave the switches on after Skylab's last maneuver. Thomason sends the activating signal. The first radio command in 4 years starts Skylab's electronic heart beating. Exclaims Thomason, "We have found the needle in the sky." Thomason reports his team's success to NASA administrators. He is told to hold her up, buy time.
Tomorrow, we'll tell you how the pressure builds on NASA, how NASA decides to act, then hides it from Congress and the American people. I'm Ren Breck, reporting for News Center 4.
The best you'll be able to say in the way of a prediction is what?
At roughly 2 hours, and that's going to be slightly over half an orbit.
So the best you'll be able to say is a line that goes halfway around the world.
That's right.
It sounded fishy, it smelled fishy, it was fishy. What we are talking about is NASA's tale last summer that it didn't know where Skylab would fall. That was a public story. But News Center 4 has learned that fully 3 weeks before Skylab fell, NASA scientists placed the craft onto a final flight path to the Earth. That path brought the 77-ton spacecraft down to a Western Australian landing with a precision that matched earlier NASA recoveries. In short, NASA knew where Skylab would fall, but didn't tell us. The reasons for the cover-up? Enormous political pressures on NASA from officials who had the power to cut the agency's budget. Worldwide pressure to keep the press off a story that could upset the delicate SALT II arms limitation talks with the Soviet Union. And there was another problem. Revealing where Skylab would fall could jeopardize the security of this top-secret base in Australia. The time was last summer. Everyone, the press, the American people, and most probably you on July 11th, its actual date of impact. But few back. What we had been led to believe last summer was that it would be God's will where Skylab would come down. But News Center 4's investigation found that from June 20th on, NASA had the power to modify, to alter and amend God's will. The key to all this was NASA's reentry specialist, Herman Thomason. It was Thomason who, acting on a plan arrived at following 6 months of computer projections, pushed the button on June 20th that would bring her down on target in Australia. 3 days later, after some wobbling by the spacecraft, Skylab's fall. From June 23rd on, you begin to feel more confident, do you not?
Well, we learned again how to fly Skylab in the new attitude that had never been flown and never been planned to be flown in. And yes, we did gain confidence that we could control it.
But NASA's control of Skylab had political risk. Last June, the polls. Carter aides were deeply concerned about the president's re-election chances. According to published reports, what the White House worried about was this. If NASA admits that it has control over Skylab, then an accident would provoke damning criticism on both NASA and the president. By denying control and implying that where Skylab falls depends upon God's will, then everyone can be spared the risk of looking bad. It was this thinking that might have provoked a cover-up as far back as May 14th, 1979. On that date, NASA Administrator Robert Frosch took NASA's reentry plan to the president. He asked for presidential-level coordination of communications and liaison with federal agents formed. The president had National Security Advisors Zbigniew Brzezinski get back to the NASA administrator. Brzezinski is reported to have told Frosch that the president wanted hands-off the Skylab reentry plan. It is apparent to New Center 4 that that's because NASA, by controlling the spacecraft, would deny the God's will scenario. By passing the buck to NASA, it appears to have been the White House that set into motion a series of events that would feed and nourish the Skylab mania world. It is clearly aware prior to a June 4th congressional hearing of NASA's ability to bring Skylab in. But NASA hides this fact from Congress. Bay Area Congressman John Burton chaired that hearing on NASA's plans for Skylab.
Our hearings with NASA showed that they were not being truthful and forthcoming to the American people or Congress about the problems of Skylab. NASA did know, they knew early what was going on. In my judgment, they didn't make necessary protections. They didn't give necessary information out that they should have, and the report that we issue, I think, will be quite critical of them in that area.
At the White House, there is continued concern that the president will suffer politically should there be an accident where the debris falls. And there is another complication that Brzezinski, as National Security Advisor, is aware of, a complication that has nothing directly to do with Skylab. In the dead center of Skylab's actual impact area lies a top-secret U.S.-Australian Defense Space Center. Set in the wilds of the outback near Alice Springs, Australia, the base is codenamed Merino and known as Pine Gap. Pine Gap is a reported center for the Central Intelligence Agency and for covert CIA activities. Pine Gap also represents the United States' most sophisticated spy satellite tracking station, and it is one of the largest radar installations in the world. As such, it is the key to the U.S. ability to monitor SALT II. Last July, Skylab's falling debris blazed across the skies like an accusing finger pointing at the sensitive base. One can imagine the horror with which the CIA must have regarded the prospect of having the world's press traipsing through the outback after Skylab to ultimately stumble on the base. It is for these reasons that Brzezinski notifies NASA and urges a continuation of the God's will scenario. As God willed, however, the cover-up did not work. This is Ren Breck reporting for News Center 4. From its launch on May 14, 1973, until its final re-entry on July 11, 1979, Skylab had spent over 6 years in space. She had cost $2.5 billion. But for every dollar invested by U.S. taxpayers, Skylab had generated $17 in the nation's economy. The spacecraft also enabled scientists to amass important data for our future. NASA had every reason to be proud of their bird. But NASA's failure to get the shuttle launch to save Skylab clipped off their bird's wings. Skylab's fall was now inevitable. What had gone up was coming down. Throughout the summer, the fact that Skylab was going to fall generated a worldwide mania. But New Center 4's investigation has revealed that NASA knew from at least June 23rd that it not only had control of Skylab, but that NASA could fly her in. That's because NASA's re-entry specialist, Herman Thomason, fired a sequence of commands that tied Skylab to a final orbit, Orbit 34981. Orbit 34981 corresponded to the mandate that NASA had from the President for a final flight path over an area of least population density. Of Skylab's nearly 35,000 orbits, Orbit 34981 met every criteria for a safe re-entry. But we never... Rather, NASA consistently maintained that it was God's will where Skylab would fall. By withholding information, by denying information to foreign governments, and by simply trying to control panic, NASA needlessly endangered Australian commercial aircraft who would fly straight into the re-entry path on July 11th. One State Department spokesman, when asked about possible damage, spoke reassuringly that there was nothing really to worry about, that the only living things in the way were a few kangaroos. This is the city of Perth. Nearly 1 million people live here, and it was here in Perth that air controllers caught the first glimpse of Skylab's fall at 9:31 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time. The Perth air controllers working that night told News Center 4 that no specific warning was given by the U.S. government that would have allowed them to clear the skies. Captain Bill Anderson, a pilot for McRobertson Miller Airlines, told News Center 4 that he first thought he saw oncoming aircraft lights at 9:35 a.m. We were traveling at 28,000 feet, he said, at 500 miles an hour when we saw a box shape. As it descended, it changed from bright blue to orange and red, and then broke into many pieces. Anderson also confirmed that no advance warning had been received. Other aircraft, including a Qantas 747 and a Trans-Australian 727 jet, were endangered. One of the reasons NASA may have kept quiet about where Skylab would fall, besides fearing embarrassment for the agency if they were wrong, was a concern in some government circles about an onslaught of the world's press into the Australian landing area. Government officials in the Defense Department and at the Central Intelligence Agency must have known that a massive search of the Australian outback could jeopardize a top-secret intelligence base used to track spy satellites. News Center 4 believes it was this concern for security that determined the choice of the U.S. team crash. The person chosen to head the team was not a NASA scientist, but this man, Robert Gray. Gray's title is Director of the State Department's Office of Advanced Technology, but News Center 4 has learned that Gray is an experienced political operative for the United States, a man who has been to the secret Pine Gap base at least 5 times. Tomorrow, the story of how Gray managed to hide the truth about Skylab and the Pine Gap base, and thereby continue the Skylab conspiracy. I'm Ren Breck, reporting. It was a summer of ups and downs. Last year, housing, health cost, energy, and money, they were all going up. Morale for the nation, it was going down. Expectations of the president for passage of the SALT II agreements by the Senate were up. Senate confidence in America's ability to adequately monitor SALT II was down. The DC-10 had gone up, and over Chicago, it had gone down. The president's advocacy of nuclear power was up. 3 Mile Island brought the nation's hope for this alternative energy resource down. Skylab, of course, had also gone up. But by the summer of 1979, she was definitely coming down. In Albuquerque, a doctor we know named Benson Dietz, concerned over Skylab, wrote last summer's song.
When NASA launched Skylab in '73, it was 2 steps for mankind and $10 for me. I'd rather pay taxes to put up a net than get hit by a piece of our national debt.
It's at times like these that America's sense of humor seems to blossom, and throughout the nation, plans were being laid for a national catharsis, the fall of Skylab. At the Marshall Space Flight Center, NASA's re-entry specialist Herman Thomason had developed a whole new technology for controlling Skylab, and then NASA, fearing for a potential mistake, hid the fact. White House aides concerned with the president's popularity apparently agreed. Since what goes up must come down is a natural law, God's will, so to speak, why not let God bring in Skylab? With a little help from his friends. It was this little distortion that generated worldwide mania, and it covered everyone's tale. On July 17th, 6 days after Skylab died, NASA sent a team to Perth to investigate the re-entry. The man who headed that visit was Robert Gray, director of the State Department's Office of Advanced Technology. At least, that's what the Australian press were told. Congressional sources tell News Center 4 they suspect otherwise, that Gray may in fact be CIA. Gray denies this. News Center 4 has since learned that Robert Gray is an experienced political operative for the State Department, skilled in handling touchy assignments, and it was certainly touchy in Perth last July when the NASA team arrived. The press wanted to know first if NASA knew even 7 hours ahead that Skylab would fall on Australia.
I think that 7 hours ahead would be the margin of error on either side no one at NASA would have been able to predict with any degree of precision where the thing was going to come down.
But some people at NASA did know. New Center 4 has been told by Herman Thomason, NASA's reentry specialist, that Skylab never left her final path from June 23rd on. That's 18 days before Skylab fell. Skylab landed in Western Australia within a margin of error of less than 3%. The fall of Skylab on July 11th came after 6 months of computer projections that clearly pinpointed the final orbit and the final flight path of the spacecraft.
Then the questions turned to a place called Pine Gap, and the answers from Robert Gray became short and strained.
What dealings did you have with the Pine Gap Communications Center in all of this? Did you have any communication with them? Absolutely none. None.
Mr. Gray, our State Department has been very kind to send you down here to speak here with the NASA team. I'm wondering, I understand that perhaps a portion of this spacecraft has landed near a base called Pine Gap. As a member of the American Press Corps, what is Pine Gap and why is it in the central of Australia?
I have no comment on that, and I'll have no further comment on that particular question.
Thank you.
So you're not prepared to even mention anything about Pine Gap? If we asked you whether you'll be seeing the people at Pine Gap while you're here, can you give me an answer to that question? I will answer no further questions on Pine Gap or in any aspect of it.
Why the mystery? Why does Gray refuse to either confirm or deny to the press any information regarding the Pine Gap facility? Tomorrow night, we'll tell you why, and we'll take you to a town called Alice Springs, Australia. It's a town with a deadly neighbor, a top-secret American intelligence base. I'm Ren Breck, reporting for News Center 4.
Anybody who really thinks about it must be concerned about the existence of that base near Alice Springs, because it's almost certainly a nuclear target, and it's almost certainly run by the Central Intelligence Agency.
John Reeves is an active member of Australia's Labor Party. His concern about living next to a secret American intelligence base is shared by other residents of Alice Springs and people across Australia. Last summer, the security of this base was jeopardized by an apparently unrelated event, the fall of Skylab on July 11th. In complying with President Carter's goal of bringing the dying spacecraft down into an area of least population, NASA scientists placed Skylab on a specific final orbit. The director of that maneuver was NASA's reentry specialist, Herman Thomason. Thomason pushed the buttons on June 20th, and after a few days of wobbling by the spacecraft, was convinced that Skylab was under control. That was more than 2 weeks before Skylab's crash, yet top NASA officials, who were kept informed of Dr. Thomason's progress, hid the fact that Skylab's descent was under the agency's control. Unknown to Thomason, and certainly to all but a few government officials, the orbit of least population would point Skylab's falling debris at one of the top ultra-secret U.S. installations in the world, the Pine Gap Joint American-Australian Space Defense Research Center. The function of the Pine Gap base is clear, according to New York Times Bureau Chief Robert Lindsay. It is to control and to gather data sent back from space by spy satellites. One reason for Pine Gap's importance is that it was key to monitoring the SALT II Arms Limitation Treaty that President Carter had signed with the Soviet Union. The American Senate was skeptical about our ability to monitor, particularly following the loss of 3 vital surveillance stations in Iran. The pressure was on to demonstrate that SALT II could be adequately monitored. In a little town like Alice Springs, the American presence is conspicuous, but the work they do is hidden in silence. Even the representative to the Australian Parliament from this area is unable to obtain satisfactory information about Pine Gap for himself and his constituents.
I believe that I, as a representative of that area, have a right to know what is the real purpose and the function of the Pine Gap installation, as I believe also that I think that many of my constituents have a right to know. I've asked for access to the Pine Gap installation, but I've been actually denied access. I believe that the people of this area need a guarantee that the Pine Gap installation will not be a target in the event of a nuclear war.
Published reports give substance to Representative Perkins' worst fears about Pine Gap being a vital U.S. strategic base. Victor Marchetti, former executive assistant at the CIA, says Pine Gap was built as part of Project Rhyolite. Rhyolite involves a single stationary satellite positioned 22,000 miles above the Earth. Rhyolite, says Marchetti, can suck up like a vacuum cleaner Soviet and Chinese military communications, radio signals, and radar, and beam them back to Pine Gap. According to an Australian defense specialist, Dr. Desmond Ball, Pine Gap is the world's biggest radar installation for tracking spy satellites. The oblong buildings, Ball says, house a huge computer room, and the people working inside comprise the largest concentration of CIA employees outside of CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Dr. Ball says Pine Gap today is the key American listening post for surveillance of the Soviet Union. The base receives a steady stream of photos from American spy satellites. Ball believes that a new series of satellites makes it possible for CIA agents in the field, including those inside China and the Soviet Union, to communicate directly through Pine Gap to CIA headquarters in Virginia. I was in Perth last summer when the NASA team arrived in Australia to investigate Skylab's crash. When I asked about Pine Gap, the leader of the American team clammed up tight.
I will answer no further questions on Pine Gap aspect of it.
At the time, I didn't understand why our government officials there were not more open. Only later did the idea occur to me that Gray's mission for Skylab might be closely tied to keeping the security lid on Pine Gap. New Center 4 believes that the American intelligence community must have been deeply concerned that the fall of Skylab would bring hordes of the world's press into the area. Already, the bases were vital. Some of the nation's most vital strategic discoveries have been made through aerial reconnaissance. By the time these photos of Soviet missiles were taken by a U-2 over Cuba in 1962, plans were already in place for reconnaissance satellites. But satellites are useless without ground stations. Back in the 1960s, the builders of Pine Gap could not possibly have guessed that their base would be jeopardized by a falling American space station.
When that happened last July, it provoked two separate cover-ups. First, NASA never disclosed where Skylab would fall. And second, the American people have still not been told by their leaders about Pine Gap and America's secret war in space. I'm Ren Breck reporting for News Center 4.